Hi, I'm Carl Barks, the Duck Man. I suppose some of you people have heard of me, especially if you've read some of my stories about Donald Duck, Uncle Scrooge, the Beagle Boys. Well, I wrote those comic book stories for 23 years. I wrote about 500 of them, so I imagine you have an idea that I must be some sort of an odd character to have ever created those many characters, and you'll find by looking at this tape that I am pretty much of an odd character.
Carl, how was it that your family became located in Merrill, Oregon?
Well, that was before my time, but my father was, of course, like all young bachelors in those days, looking for some free land so he could start a farm of his own. And so he heard about the homestead land in the sagebrush country up in eastern Oregon, and he left his job as a blacksmith in the big grain ranches in central California, and he went up to Oregon and located 160 acres that nobody was on, and it looked like it was good level land and good soil, and he established a claim on that.
Was that in the 1880s?
That was in the 1880s. I don't know just what year in the 1880s, but it was a long time ago.
When you came along in 1901, were you born in a hospital?
I was born in a little two-room shack that they had on the farm. It had become a farm by then. It grubbed out the sagebrush and grown crops of wheat and rye. And this little two-room shack had a stove and table in one room and a bed and chairs, I guess, or so in the other room.
And you were born right there?
I was born there.
Did your father eventually build a house on the property? Or?
He built a larger house, I guess about 1903, sometime like that. He built a larger house. It was a two-story house with 4 bedrooms.
Do you remember any humorous things as a child when you were growing up?
Humor. It was a grim life. We didn't take time to laugh about anything. It was pretty serious.
Many people are fascinated with a one-room schoolhouse. Could you tell us about that?
Well, one-room schoolhouses were the thing in those days because there were no motorized buses and people lived far apart. And a one-room schoolhouse was very practical because we're in an area where there were, say, 10 families living. There would be a number of children who would be in the first grade, just little ones. And then there would be some who were in the third and fourth grade, and a very few who were larger. So there was all this variety of children, maybe 15 children going to this one-room schoolhouse, and the teacher would teach all the different grades. He would teach the little primary grades, and we could all hear what was going on in the rest of the schoolhouse because it's just one big room, and we in the older grades could watch the little kids learning how to write on the blackboard, and I guess the little kids learned something by watching us older kids write on the blackboard. So it was a very practical system. I think they should have more of that now.
It seemed that your life was really pretty hard in those days, plowing the fields and riding a horse into the one-room schoolhouse, and people are curious to where that wonderful sense of humor comes from.
I don't know where it came from. I don't think I ever laughed until I was about 50 years old. Oh, I was a real sourpuss all of those years.
You were a pretty serious student, you think?
Oh, I was a serious student. Yes, I shined in arithmetic and history, and geography was another I liked. The serious subjects. I didn't care much for the English grammar. It was too difficult for me to solve the riddle of adjectives and adverbs and sentence structures.
Could you tell us a little bit about the work on the farm?
Well, the work on the farm was from the time you got up in the morning until it was dark at night. You lived by the same life pattern that the chickens have. You get up at daylight and go to bed at sundown.
Do you have memories of plowing the field, or?
Oh, I have memories of it, yes. There was something nice about sitting on a plow. The riding type plow was very pleasant. You sat there and you'll watch the plowshare shearing through the ground and turning over the sod. There was something nice about that. Of course, I had to drive a team of horses pulling that plow. It would have been so much more pleasant to have had one of those nice air-conditioned tractors that they have nowadays.
Did your family support you in your desire to be a cartoonist?
Oh, well, yes, they did. It kept me out of mischief, I guess. Not that I would have gotten into anyway. I was a good, obedient kid.
Do you remember the first comic book strip that you read?
It must have been Little Nemo. The San Francisco Examiner, which we got once a week, had all the comic strips in the pages, and they were in color, if I remember right, and that's the one that I remember most clearly.
You seem to have a long list of occupations when you left the farm. Kind of reminds me of Donald Duck's occupations. What occupations were those?
Well, I worked one summer in the logging woods as a logger, and then I picked grapes in the vineyards in Southern California, and I got work in railroad yards and working in the railroad car shops for several years. And I worked in a sawmill, and I did a little carpenter work, and just about anything that was hard physical labor that paid very small wages.
How did it come about that you sold your first cartoon?
Well, it came about because at that time I was working in railroad car shops on a riveting gang, and I hated the work very much. And I had always been practicing cartooning, and I saw a magazine publishing pictures, hand-drawn pictures by artists that I knew were no better at their trade than I was. So I drew a few cartoons that put little jokes on them, little punchlines, and sent them to a magazine called the Calgary Eye Opener. And they bought one of the pictures, but they didn't buy any of my jokes. However, I got, it was either $2 or $3 for that little picture. Well, right away, I could just envision myself getting rich as an artist, and From that time on, I concentrated very much on learning to draw better and think of jokes that would sell. And I was beginning to sell art fast enough that it was feeling pretty good.
So you were a freelancer for a while.
I was a freelancer, yes. That was through 1928, 1929. I was selling quite a few pictures and jokes.
How did you ever end up in Minneapolis?
Well, I was selling most of my stuff to this Calgary eye-opener in Minneapolis. And I had reached a point where I was putting more stuff into the magazine than anybody else. And when they had some editorial trouble with the editor was not appearing on the job often enough, why they fired him and asked if I would come back there and take over as a part-time assistant editor and staff writer. So they sent me money enough to come back there on the train, and I did it.
Well, then how did you end up going from Minneapolis to Burbank?
I knew that the magazine was not going to succeed for very long. And I was trying to develop a writing style by which I might be able to sell cartoons to magazines in New York, like College Humor and Esquire, magazines like that. But I didn't have time to do that, and I saw an article in the newspaper that said Walt Disney was hiring artists out at the studio. And they required sample drawings. So I sent some sample drawings to Walt Disney's, and I was told to come out and go to work.
I guess in 1935 and 1936 that you had some pretty famous Disney people in your art classes.
In those years, there was a very good crop of beginners came to work at Disney. Once each month, there was about 9 or 10 artists selected from various parts of the country to come and try out at Disney's in the animation department. And that is where the 9 old men came from. There may have been 1 or 2 of the 9 old men who were already at Disney's, but here came Mark Davis and Phil Duncan and Hugh Fraser, and Eric Larson, a whole bunch of extremely good artists who became the great artists that drew Pinocchio and Fantasia and all those great pictures that followed. I was not one of those. I started out in the in-betweens, and I very quickly found out that it was not my cup of tea. But I submitted so many good gags to the story department that Walt decided I belonged in the story department. So did I ever feel good, though, when they moved me to the story department, and I started in there at $65 a week. I would have been getting 20 if I had stayed on in the in-betweens.
I understand that quite frequently you were able to get Walt Disney to do things your way.
Well, yes. When he would come in on story conferences, he would let us show what we had on storyboards and argue a point or two with him about the merits of some particular gag. He would let us tell our side of it, and listen politely and even give us the last word in the argument, which was always, yes, Walt.
Did he seem to have a knack for storytelling?
Oh, yes. Yes, he would right away pick out whether we had the knack, too. He'd quickly decide whether the story was moving the right way. And if it wasn't, he would tell us the right way it should move. And after the story conference, why, he would either tell us to shelve the story or keep on with it and make some changes, and then he would be back later to see it.
Do you think he could have been an artist himself?
He certainly could have. Perhaps he just didn't like the physical part of drawing. He could visualize the most magnificent pictures in his head, but the hard work of changing that mental image to something on a piece of paper it took too much of his time, I think. He was just too busy to do that kind of work, and he could hire somebody to do it.
He had a reputation, other than being a genius, for being a really hard worker. Did you see that?
Oh, yes. Yes, I don't think he had a reputation for going and playing polo and such things, but I don't think he was playing polo. I think he was thinking up gags while he was riding around on that horse.
On the first Donald Duck adventure comic book, how did that happen that you and Jack Hanna worked on that together?
Well, that happened because somebody from Western Publishing Company came out to Disney's to see if they had any material that would make a long story for a full-length comic book. And they had a crew working for a while on the story. It was to be Mickey and Goofy, I believe, looking for pirate gold. And they had this parrot in there, and it was very much the same formula as was made into a movie or a comic book story about Donald. And when these Western publishing people saw that, they said that would make an awfully good story if some of the writers and artists there at Disney could make a story script of that would fit comic book format and have some artists draw it. Why, they would like to make a comic book of it. So it happened that Bob Karp, who worked in the comic strip department, wrote the story script, and I drew half of the drawings, and Jack Hanna drew the other half, and it turned out to be a very successful story called Pirate Gold. It was so successful that even Disney took an interest in seeing comic books being produced.
After 7 years at the Disney studio, somehow you went from being an air-conditioned artist to being a non-air-conditioned chicken farmer. How did that happen?
Well, that happened because I got to where I could hardly breathe in the air conditioning in the studio. My mucous membranes in my nose all closed up, and I couldn't breathe except through my mouth, and I had awful hay fever all the time. And after I got out to San Jacinto, where the sun was hot day and night, and I was raising chickens, so my health came back to where I felt real good again. And that's how I got out there. And after I'd been there a short time, I heard from somebody working at Disney's in the licensing division. I can't remember her name now, but she wrote me a note saying that the people at Western Publishing were going to try an original Donald Duck story for their comic book, the first of the Walt Disney comics and stories that would carry a 10-page opening story about Donald. And would I be willing to draw it? And I said, yes, I sure would. So the people at Western Publishing sent me a script, and I drew it, but the script looked so, it didn't tell the story right. And having had 4 years experience, or 6 years experience writing stories at Disney's, I knew how a story should be put together, and I made some changes in it. And when they read that story at the publishing house and realized that I had changed it and made it better, they were so astonished. They told me to go ahead and do the writing after that I could write my own stories.
Was that famous Victory Garden story?
That was the Victory Garden story. Yes, I changed it around and changed scenes and timing in that to where it finally made some sense.
There's another famous comic book story that you did about Pleasant Valley that turned into the town of Omelette. Was that related in any way to any humor that might have been going on at your chicken ranch?
Well, I found out enough about chickens and eggs running that chicken ranch that I could see a lot of humorous possibilities. But writing those stories for the comic books was just a matter of trying to think of some situation that would fill 10 pages of good humor, good stories at a beginning and a middle and an end that all made some sense and hooked together. And I could see enough material in Donald having a chicken ranch, how many mistakes he could make, and I put it together, and it was a very funny story, as it turned out. I could not have worked that story with Mickey running the chicken ranch. I'm sure it would never work with Goofy running the chicken ranch. It was just Donald and his bravado and his brassiness that made the story successful.
But how did it come that when you'd use a new character?
Well, so often when I was writing stories, I would think of some story that Donald and the kids could get into, some situation that would be awfully funny, but they needed somebody else in there. They had to have somebody for a foil, a merchant or a sea captain or somebody who could be the goat for their adventures. Therefore, I was always inventing new characters to help make the story interesting and help Donald and the kids have enough to do.
How did it come about that you created the word Duckburg?
Oh, well, that came about just out of necessity. I couldn't mention the Disney studio being the residence of all these people. And I finally just thought, well, why not just call it Duckburg, because that's where the ducks live. Their little village.
What kind of a place was Duckburg?
It changed every time I had a story. It was a village, it was a big city, it was a city on the ocean and a city in the desert. It was wherever I needed it. I was reading a story just the other day of where they had a big lighthouse that was situated on Cape Quack. And that would have been strictly in New England, way back in Massachusetts or Maine. Yet that was where Duckburg was.
It's interesting to people that Duckburg seems so changeable and moves around. It seemed that the money bin moved around too. Sometimes it'd be downtown, or sometimes it'd be a lake.
Well, that's right. I generally put it up on a rise of ground so that it stood out above the other buildings around there, but I certainly did put a variety of buildings around the money bin. I never had any particular formula for drawing those things. If you looked at those stories critically, you could find an awful lot of changes made in Duckburg.
What kind of a person is Donald Duck?
I wouldn't call him a person. Oh, Donald is, he is any person he is required to be to fill some particular situation in a story. So perhaps he is an actor. I have to think of him as an actor.
You've had a joke that you love Louis but hate Huey, but can you tell us a little bit about the personalities of the nephews and how they changed over the years?
Well, the nephews started out at the studio just being brats, who were just mischievous brats who were almost mean, you might say, in the vindictive things they could think of and tricks they could play on Uncle Donald and all. And I changed them in my stories. I made them so that they thought of a lot of tricks that were good tricks, which they foiled somebody like Donald when he was doing something he shouldn't do. They would come up with a good trick that would foil him, and so they became the brains of the place, not Donald.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Junior Woodchuck Manual?
Well, the Junior Woodchuck Manual is the most magical book in the world. It has all the knowledge in the world. It must be very small because they carry it around in the pocket, and you never can see a pocket on those little tight sweaters they wear. So it must be a book that's not much bigger than a postage stamp, but it contains an awful lot of knowledge.
Who are the Junior Woodchucks of the world?
Well, they are a club, a sort of a paramilitary club that they have their meetings, and they're patterned a little bit after the Boy Scouts.
Could you describe Gyro Gearloose for us?
Well, Gyro Gearloose is Thomas A. Edison with a chicken beak, except that old Gyro, he makes up inventions that are not quite as practical as Edison's inventions, but he always trying to think of something that'll make a real good, beneficial thing for the human race, and he always boggles it one way or another. Anyway, he is a comic inventor that all cartoonists should keep in their stable.
That little helper, the light bulb man that came on a couple years after Gyro, was sure a funny little character.
Well, I first invented him just to have something to put in the panels with Gyro. It looked so stiff and dead to me to have Gyro working on some complex invention and just talking to himself in thought balloons, and nothing to look at in there except just Gyro and with whatever he was working on. And sometimes those things required such long development that the panels began to drag. So I thought, well, there has to be something in these panels besides gyro that will let people have more time to look at each panel. And I put this little helper in there. I first had the little helper just sort of standing around or sitting on Gyro's shoulder or something like that to create a bit of interest. Then I began inventing things for the helper to do, so that while Gyro was up in the middle part of the picture, the little helper's down in a corner in big adventures by himself. And he caught on, and people liked him very much. I'm sure that within 2 or 3 more years, they would have had to have had a comic book in which he was the star actor.
In 1947, in the comic book Christmas on Bear Mountain, we were treated to seeing Uncle Scrooge for the first time. How did you think of him?
Oh, I thought of him as just a typical old miser. And I think one of the first thoughts I had of him was of, oh, miser gripping his money. He just loved the feel of this stuff. And I guess that whole character just came to me in a flash like that, and that's the way I built him from that time on, except I would change him once in a while and give him a soft spot. But that's the way I first visualized him, the way I used him in his first story. First view of him, he was just an old miser sitting in his chair on Christmas, and he knew that everybody hated him, and he hated everybody. He got all the money he needed to let the other people go to hell.
What is the relationship between Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge?
The relationship is, I guess it changes from time to time, but it seems to have kind of boiled down to where Uncle Scrooge uses Donald as a sort of a helper and someone he can depend on. Whenever he needs to have help, he can always depend on Donald and the kids to work for him. And I think he trusts them to be his friend in any situation he gets into. And Donald and the kids treat Uncle Scrooge as if he's a little bit wacky. He's got all this crazy idea about making money, but they will go along and help him just because he's their uncle.
How about the relationship between Donald Duck and the kids, Huey, Dewey, and Louie?
Well, that too changed from time to time. At times I've had Donald be quite a loving parent, and at other times a real stern parent. He's got those kids, and he's going to raise them, and come what may, he's going to do it. Now, I think I showed Donald as being a responsible type of parent to those kids, even though they appear to be much smarter than him.
Seems in the later years, when the junior woodchucks are in full force, that the Huey, Dewey, and Louie actually become more like the parents as the bright ones.
They become like Donald's advisors, Donald's parents. They raised that boy.
What is the relationship with Uncle Scrooge and the Beagle Boys?
Oh, well, there again, that is simple. They're just a bunch of thieves trying to get his money, and he's trying to figure out ways to keep them from getting it. That rivalry between those two provided material for a great many stories.
Could you tell us a little bit about this figurine, this bronze statue of Uncle Scrooge who's diving in his money?
That bronze comes about from the fact that early on in the comics, I showed Uncle Scrooge diving around in his money, and it made a great hit, evidently, with people. And now, after all these years, people still are fascinated with the old boy and his method of playing with money. And this pose of Scrooge diving is in several stories. And a sculptor in Anaheim, I believe it was, made a figure of this and cast it in bronze, and it has become very successful.
Who was it that said, "No man is poor who can do what he wants to do once in a while"?
Well, that was something I made up to justify Uncle Scrooge's way of constantly saving money, and all while it never brings him any great fun. He has no other fun in life than just diving around in that money. He said that no man is poor who can do what he wants to do once in a while.
Were there, you had such a variety of stories. How did you get the idea for such diverse stories?
Well, in doing that work, you had to get the variety. You just had to get new, unusual story plots, because that's what sold the books. It was just a matter of necessity. Write good stories, write fresh, new ideas, write complex things that you make look simple.
Your stories seem to have such a knack for keeping the words down to a minimum and having the exact meaning that you were looking for.
I know it. That is one of the secrets of timing. When you read a story, if it got so much dialogue in the dialogue balloons that you bog down reading that dialogue, so that when you turn to the next panel, you've forgotten where the characters were in the previous panel. The dialogue just takes over the story, and when you've finished, you'll have a tired feeling from reading. So I put that dialogue, cut it down as short as I could, told as much of the story as I could with drawing. And I would read the dialogue over and over. And there is a trick to making a quick changeover in dialogue by just counting the syllables. If you've got a word that's got too many syllables in it, and it kind of slows the whole sentence down, change that word. I would go into dialogue balloons and just analyze them down to the last syllable, so that just count it out. It was almost like reading music.
Seems like some of your climaxes would be just built up to a crescendo.
That's right, yes.
Was it frequent that you would put just one climax or one major happening per story?
Well, on a short story, 10-page story, there shouldn't be more than one good, strong climax. But there should be 2 or 3 other pretty darn good wallops in there on the way up.
In your adventure stories, you seem to have a wonderful knack of teaching kids things about foreign lands without preaching.
Well, that was all part of making a story interesting. Make the country look like the country where they are. If they're in Asia, make it look like some part of Asia. And I would look for background material in travel magazines, geographic and places like that. No, I tried to get the sincerity and the feeling of reality into my stories. I believe it paid off.
Your comic book covers had such a nice symmetry. Was this the beginning of laying out symmetry for your oil paintings?
Well, yes, in a way it was. That symmetrical conciseness you see in the covers. Well, I was told how to do those covers by the art editors down at the publishing outfit. The first few I did, they sent me a rough sketch of exactly the proportions that I had to draw those ducks, always with the duck's head so big. The ducks, like Donald's head, would need to take up, I think, almost 1/4 or 1/5 of the area of the cover, exclusive of the title. So I had to learn to cram an awful lot of stuff into a very little space and accentuate the ducks' heads. I didn't carry that part of it over into my paintings, though. In my paintings, the ducks were all proper proportions. But I did realize that all those things have to be followed. Everything you need to show has to be so clearly delineated and colored and accentuated so that you see it with one quick glance. When you look at the painting, you see it all right there.
Well, for years you were able to maintain a solitude, but was it Esther Williams who first wrote you as a fan letter?
No, I got a fan letter from a young kid in Aptos, California. He wrote quite a long fan letter to me about how great my stuff was. I didn't believe it. I thought it was a joke on me by some of the fellows who worked for Hank Ketchum doing the gags for Dennis the Menace. They lived up at Carmel, which was very close there, and I thought, oh, that's just some trick they did. They composed this fan letter and mailed it in Aptos and said they were this guy, this phony guy that had written this letter. And it turned out that it was a real letter.
I guess officially it was Malcolm Willits who came up and met you personally.
He was the first fan that I ever met personally, yes.
Have you ever seen Malcolm since those years?
Oh, quite often. Oh, there are, of course, many years by that I don't see him, but I've seen him in quite a few places in the world since then. He gets around. He's a very successful collector and promoter of duckisms.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Willits here in Hollywood, California, and I own the Collector's Bookstore at Hollywood and Vine, which mostly sells movie memorabilia. But in the past, we have sold a good bit of Carl Barks material too. And actually, I'm one of Carl's oldest fans because I first began reading his work in 1942, and that's when he began his work, was in 1942. And I started collecting it in 1945. And believe me, in 1945, no young boy was expected to collect Walt Disney material. It just wasn't done. I think one thing interesting about Carl Barks is that his stories, many people feel, are timeless. That means they're as good today as they were 50 years ago and probably be just as good 50 years from now. For instance, even during World War II, Well, a lot of the other comic strip artists and comic book artists were writing propaganda stories about the evil Nazis and bombing the Japanese and everything. Carl was in a world of his own. His stories dealt with everyday problems connected with just living. Somehow I feel Carl Barks is one of the few who have really given a positive image of the United States throughout the world. And that's one of the best things I think he's done, and he's done it through the realm of comic books.
What do you think about all these people that are analyzing your stories and looking for hidden meanings?
I think they must have something better to do. The stories were just fairy stories. They were just stories put together for a bunch of gags. There was no real deep meaning in any of them. But they like to claim they find some deep meaning. They must have thought I was a tremendous intellectual. And I never had time to be one, even if I could have.
There's a whole series of non-Disney ducks and non-Disney oil paintings. How did those come about?
Well, when I didn't have permission to paint the Disney ducks, I had to paint subjects of my own invention. And I painted some cowboy scenes, and I painted little landscapes and various things that I thought would sell. Very few of them ever sold. But
Who is Billy the Duckling?
well, those were some watercolors I did that they sold. They sold very well. Little watercolors of famous figures of history, as they might have looked, had their genes gotten mixed with waterfowl. That was the excuse I had for putting duck bills on human faces. And that's what people seemed to want. The people who wanted those watercolors wanted me to make them look like ducks, but they could be human in all other respects. So that was how I got into that deal, and they were successful. I hope to see a book published of those little watercolors. They had a lot of sarcasm and humor in them.
We hear a lot of reports lately about people fighting over your Disney oil paintings with money, and the prices seem to be just getting extremely high. We hear $200,000 a couple of times over. And what was the original prices of those paintings back in the 70s?
Well, I started my paintings at $150, and I was quite timid asking $150, because I thought maybe the guy would give me $50 for it. But it came out that he was glad to get it for $150, and so I painted quite a number in $150 that now sell for several thousand. As for the prices going up and up, $200,000 for a painting, you know, that just whets my appetite, and I think, suppose we could get some of those big Japanese computer millionaires to come over here and buy my paintings. Maybe they'd pay $1 million for one of them. I just get like Uncle Scrooge, I think, got something good going here.
My specialty in the field of Carl Barks's art is with the original drawings, the original ink drawings and pencil drawings that he created in the production of the comic book stories. The original works that Carl did in actual production of the comic book stories have also become much more in demand than they were when they first started to appear on the market 30 years ago. These original ink drawings will sell for between $5,000 and $10,000 a piece, and they, in a sense, are more interesting to a certain kind of collector. The collector who is fascinated with the work of Carl Barks oftentimes began reading the comic book stories. And this is the medium to which that collector always returns. And to have an original work, an ink drawing on paper or a pencil sketch on paper that Carl actually created when he was producing one of these comic book stories is very special to that kind of collector.
What do you think about the violent comics of today?
I'm afraid they've gone a little too far with that violence and men with stupendous muscles. And in the superhero comics, they have gotten completely away from the human race into a bunch of mutants that are no interest to living people.
How would you compare the giant Walt Disney Company of today with the small Walt Disney Company that you worked for in the 30s?
Oh, it is no longer the same company. In the 30s, it was a one-man company. It was Walt and his brother Roy holding on to Walt's purse strings that made a company. And it was an operation that was simple from the top to the bottom. Everything moved along the lines of thought of one man. Now it is a scattered company with vice presidents in every direction. But it is the only way that the Walt Disney Company, as it stands now, could compete in this world in which all companies are like that. They have a very good operation there at Disney now. And it's composed of a lot of guys who know how to operate as a group.
What is the future of comic books with all the modern things going on, internet and the different games on TV and all the modern technology?
I am very much scared that comics don't have a very good future. There will have to be a cycle in which reader interest goes back to reading again. Right now, it seems that everybody's mind is caught up on these new games that come on television and things that you can get by pressing a button and watching a monitor. Pretty soon the mind will tire of those things and perhaps will go back to reading. The wonderful thought of being alone with your thoughts and having something in your hand that you can just read and enjoy rather than having to sit in front of a television monitor looking at somebody else's stuff moving around on the screen. You're just a spectator. You're not doing anything to help yourself understand what's going on.
I think the fans would like to know a little bit about your particular way of drawing. Do you, for instance, do worksheets before you draw, or do you draw it out in a blue pencil?
Oh, I drew everything. For the comic books, I drew directly onto the drawing paper. I drew in blue pencil because blue pencil will not pick up on engravers' films or solutions. So I drew in blue pencil and worked out all the compositions right on the drawing paper, panel by panel. Even laid out my dialogue in blue pencil. And when I had gotten that nice and tight and ready to go, I got out my pen and inked it. With the other artists, a great many of them did their sketches on a piece of transparent paper, copy tracing paper, drew their rough sketches. Then they put that transparent paper on a light board with a light under it, and put their drawing paper over the top of that rough drawing that was illuminated, and they could see the lines of the drawing through the drawing paper, and they inked on top of that. Made nice, clean inking. You saw none of the construction lines, but it was just too much work for me, and I liked the old way of doing it. And my principal tool was an eraser. I used that more than I did my pencils.
Carl, I'm holding in my hand what looks to be a figurine. It says, Carl Barks Lifetime Achievement Award, 1993. What is this?
That is a figurine that I made, or at least I designed it, for an award given out by a big comic distributor who has a convention every year in which he gives out awards for excellence in various forms of comic book work. And this Barkster is the award that goes for excellence in inking or in story work or in art, many of the various things that make comic books great, and they called it the Barkster, which is quite an honor because my stories over 20-some years had supposedly never lost their quality.
Carl, I'm going to ask you some short questions, and just say whatever comes to your mind first. In what years would the money have been erected?
It would have been built possibly back in the early 1920s.
What qualities do you most appreciate in a man?
Well, honesty.
And what qualities do you most appreciate in a woman?
Beauty and brains.
And your favorite virtue?
Well, that would be honesty and sincerity.
What is your dream of happiness?
Well, I would say it would always be a dream, because I can't think of anything that would make me happier than just being a guy drawing ducks.
And what is your present mental state?
I think I need to see a psychiatrist right away.
Do you have a motto?
Yes, I have a motto. It's do unto others as you would have them do to you.
Carl, when you began inventing Duckburg, did you ever dream that you would provide work for just hundreds and hundreds of people printing 20 million comic books a month?
I had no idea that that would happen, but I'm certainly glad it did. I think it is wonderful that the ducks became so popular all over the world that they made jobs for many more artists and writers, made jobs for publishers, and have become quite an industry. I am very glad to see that happen.
Do you have any special messages for your comic book fans?
Well, my special message is that I admire their taste very much, and I hope that they always find the duck comics so good that they won't read anything else.
And now, the good fellows in Finland and the Carl Barks studio in the U.S. present Carl Barks Unplugged. Carl's down in his studio now. Shall we unplug Carl, Jari?
Yes, we can do that. Roll on.
All right, this is my studio where I work, and I am Carl Barks, the guy who drew the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge in the comic books for so many, many years. Yeah, over the years I have done quite a number of subjects that were not about Disney characters. Some of the subjects I had to abandon, I just never finished them, and this is one of them that I started to paint of the Queen of Sheba. And I feel that someday I'll think of a way of salvaging this painting. I will do a lot of work on her slaves she has here, and these different people, the muscle men, the trumpeters, and so on. But anyway, it is the palace of King Solomon, and she is coming in for a visit. And King Solomon can hear the jingle of she coming along with all her jiggle and squiggle. And I can probably make a good, presentable painting out of it sometime, but I just haven't had the time to do that. At any rate, that shows how far along I can go with wasting my time before I throw something away.
The king looks like he's must be the cat that he's catching there.
Oh, well, he's looking like he knows there's something real interesting coming, because there was all this blowing of horns.
The queen looks to be quite a gal.
Oh, she was quite buxom and shapely for her time.
The black fellow in the middle there, that's kind of a smoky color. What's...
Well, I figured that she would have them all made up with ash-colored makeup or various colors, and many rings in their ears and various hairdos. I never got around to putting the hair on these guys, but I will, if I ever work on it again, I will add very fantastic hairdos to these fellows.
Could you give us a little history of that? Which king is that?
That is King Solomon. Now, you're going to have to read the Bible to find out about this.
I think you've
that
got
being
me.
the Queen of Sheba. Now, that's my only history is what I found out in the Bible. And it is it's real history, too, because thousands of people have read that story, and they know who she is and who he is, and so I've got to be very careful how I present this. And I have started out, and I made it too burlesque.
It's a wonderful crown that she has with the feathers and...
Oh, she has a hairdo that could play to the top drawer entertainers in Las Vegas.
How did you think that up with that beautiful peacock on her head? And
well, I just have been to enough nightclub shows to know that that's part of the ritual.
Seems that your paintings, and especially the non-Disneys, get very intricate. You're a dress designer and a men's clothes designer and Western clothes, and here we have an example of the Queen, and you've designed a hair.
Well, it's all part of the business of composing a picture and making it interesting. Just don't slap the first thing you think of on canvas and expect somebody's going to buy it. Try to find out all the things that would make that picture interesting and use those things and paint in the very best way possible.
A number of fans are fascinated with your jewelry design, and here we see an example of a number of jewels. Do you design these yourselves, or how do you go about that?
Oh, I have I have several books on jewelry, the great collections of jewelry in the various museums of the world. So that if I need to have beautiful design for a certain setting of jewelry, I just look in one of those books and get it. These are just roughed out. I just wanted it to look like she had many sapphires and rubies and diamonds and things. They were just, she had buckets full of them, and she just has them being carried in. These haven't been refined to the point that they look like they are ready to be worn.
Jewelry seems to have a Karl Barks flair to it, and I think that fans of your oil paintings can spot a Karl Barks jewel anywhere. And you must put a flair to your jewelry.
That's right. Next to Tiffany, there's Karl Barks jewelry.
And yours is even harder to get.
You notice all the jewels I wear on my hand?
Your work area, did you design that yourself?
This order here?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Of course, this is a commercial drawing board that I bought. But I found that this drawing board is such hard wood that I couldn't put push pins into it. So I took foam core, you know what that is? And I put that on here and stapled it down. Then I put a piece of white paper over the top of that foam core, and look, stick pins in anywhere and they stay right there. And it's a wonderful surface to draw on. I think I'll patent that.
What do you use that duck for over there?
That is for drying my watercolors sometimes are slow drying, and I just put that hair dryer on them and dry the moisture out real fast. It is a very effective way of speeding up the process of painting watercolor.
Your brush, a lot of people think you have about 3 hairs in it. Do you use quite a small brush?
I have some pretty pathetic little fellows. How about this little guy here? He's pretty well used up. Some of these others, like that's a big one.
Now, how does it work? You get the ideas upstairs in your office, and then you bring it down right here, and you begin the drawings?
Oh, well, yes. Wherever I think of the idea, why, it comes with me down here. And that's where I turn it into a drawing that other people can visualize what my idea was.
How long does it take you to get an idea?
Sometimes it's several months. I wish they would just come like that. But this idea came secondhand because some stamp collectors wanted a picture and a portrait of Uncle Scrooge in this very earliest situation where he was introduced in 1947. And I looked up the earliest drawings I did on him, and there it was. All I had to do was combine those two and make it a nice composition, nice portrait of Uncle Scrooge.
When did you paint A Well-Armed Stranger?
All that was painted about 1980, I believe.
Looks like an oversized painting.
It is a 22 by 28 inches. It was big for my style. I had never painted anything that big before.
This is the one you got a nice offer on and decided to keep.
I felt that if I kept it around long enough, it might become quite valuable.
And of course you get to look at it.
Oh, I get to look at it. I would like to have the ability to paint more of those Western subjects.
What's going on in the painting?
Well, what's going on is a bunch of cowboys who come in off of a big trail drive, and they are having their drinks and the fun in a saloon at night. Now you see, this is a scene that would be typical of the Old West in the days when all the cattle drives were going on and the mines were being opened in Colorado and the sheepmen were fighting with the cattlemen. Anyway, I painted characters in here who are part of what was life in those days. We have a soldier, one of the Indian fighters, that's out fighting the Indians and protecting people by going out of the forts and chasing the Indians away. These are the dance hall girls that hung out around the bars and made money, talking the guys into having a drink. This fellow I felt was a sheep man. This guy perhaps was a freight wagon driver. This fellow a miner. This a cowboy. That's another cowboy. The sheriff, a cowboy, and perhaps another sheep man. And this is a stranger who has come in off of the trails outside, and he is loaded down with two big guns, and he looks like he could be a gunfighter. And he arouses these suspicions of the people in the bar because they don't know whether he's one of those guys who will get a couple of drinks and go crazy and start shooting with these big guns. Anyway, they are all looking at his guns. The ones over here who would have to turn around to see him, he looks at these guys to see what they're looking at. See? Yeah, they're all very curious about that guy. Anyway, he is a well-armed stranger, and he is a suspicious character.
Carl, what is the name of this painting?
Called Worth a Whole Month's Wages.
Seems like it's a lot happier than the other scene where they're so dangerous.
Oh, yeah, this is where they're having a good time. They've just come in from a big trail drive, and they've all gotten their paychecks, and they're having fun.
Is this like a dime a dance, or are they just buying her drinks?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't around in those days, but I think it was a case of you buy the girl a drink, and of course it was just water or tea that she drank, but you got a slug of rot gut, and she would dance with you if you paid her enough money, I guess.
It's a beautiful dress you designed there.
Oh, yes, I'm very good at that, designing dresses. That's another trade I should have gotten into.
You left a lot of petticoat going out there.
Uh-oh, petticoat? Oh, so there is. Yes, that's right, they wore a lot of petticoats in those days. Yeah, you see on this one here, you can see a lot of drawing underneath that. How I changed the size of the chair and the size of the windows. You can see where the curtains used to be. And I had a bunch of books over here on this side, and I changed that to a bunch of coins. And all these lines around here shows how I changed the borders of the picture. I took transparent paper with the border of the picture and I moved it around so that to get Uncle Scrooge sitting in exactly the right spot he should be in relation to the border. So this is a working drawing. I try to work about, 6 hours a day when I got something really good going. And those hours probably wouldn't even start until afternoon because in the morning hours, I never feel like doing anything. Now here's another thing. After I do the cleanup sketch on this guy here, see, I put a piece of paper over him and cleaned him up, put him in the proper place in the border. Then I put this on my copy machine and reduce it down in size to where it is this size. I reduce it down to that size. Then I put one of those little sketches, paste it down on a piece of paper, and I use my colored pencils to make a little test drawing in colored pencil to work out a color scheme. You can see in here where I have made some changes. There's a line showing that I changed the shape of the chair and other things. With the colored pencils, I can put a color on there, and if I don't like it, I can just take an eraser and erase it off of there. Put on a different color. Anyway, this looked like it had possibilities, so I used that as a base for making my colored painting. And as I showed you over here,
Are the colors matching up pretty closely?
no. No, they are not. This one is not yet finished. I have quite a bit of color balancing still to do on that. I haven't got it just right, but I've got good strong values in there. I am now an old man, but I still paint ducks and I still draw the ducks. I still love those ducks.
Seems like we've known Carl and Gary Barks for quite a while now.
Well, it was 16 years ago that we went to Temecula to visit them for the first time, and it was the first of many visits.
Gee, that was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, Gary got quite ill about 8 years ago.
Yeah, she was managing Carl's business quite well up until that point, and I think that when her health failed, it was more and more difficult for her to deal with all of the loose ends of color proofs and all the projects people wanted to do. And I think that's really when Carl cut back a lot of his work.
It was sure a shock to us. We moved in 3 days later, Gary died, and we were just creating the Carl Barks studio.
Yes, she was supposed to be our teacher, but it didn't work out that way.
Well, it's really been fun all these years. Seems like we always have about 20 projects, and Carl just loves it that way because he just loves to create, and he doesn't want to do the business end of things or all the groundwork that goes into these projects, such as this Dancing Mickey.
Well, the Mickey was a lot of phone calls and a lot of work, sculpts going back and forth, and yeah, it was a neat project, but it would have been very difficult for an artist to try to do that and be creative in other things.
Seems like we're always traveling now. We've been to Disneyland Paris this year, and Orlando twice, and Disneyland and Disneyland Paris. These projects really keep us hopping.
And Carl wouldn't be able to keep up that kind of a travel schedule. And even if he could, he wouldn't be able to produce the artwork that he's been able to produce this year.
He's happy creating.
Very. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kathy Morby with the Carl Barks Studio. At any given time at the Carl Barks Studio, we have 20 projects going on. What we are, really, is the business end of Carl Barks. He's the genius and the creator. He sits at his easels and creates all these wonderful artworks. And then Bill and I translate them into projects. Some of them become two-dimensional lithographs. Some become serigraphs. And in the last 2 years, we've started doing some work on bronzes, sculptures. It's been an interesting medium for Carl because he can't physically create the sculpture. It requires a lot of coordination. The person that does the sculpt has been up here 5, 6, 7 times just on one particular bronze. We've been down to LA. Then we've gone to the foundry. And I think that the reason these have been so successful and why everyone has felt that they're truly Barks pieces is because Carl has spent a lot of time working on corrections. So our day-to-day is answering the phone, fielding questions. Oh, people want provenance on artwork. What did Carl do this particular piece for? Or is this Carl? We're constantly getting things faxed to us. Did Carl draw this? And if he did, will he sign it? Will he sign it for free? I don't know, probably once a week we get a call from somebody somewhere in the world who wants to do a documentary film on Carl. I guess the more press and publicity that's out there, the more people think up projects that might potentially make them money and hopefully make Carl some money along the way. And we have to sort of sort those out with Carl, the wheat from the chaff, the good ones from the ones that are really not best for Carl. It's an exciting job, and it takes the two of us all of our time.
Hi, I'm Bill Grandy at the Carl Barks Studio. People get curious as to what we do, and if I could just say it in one word, I'd say deadlines. Deadlines, deadlines, deadlines. To give you, for instance, when the Invasion of Privacy watercolor got done, we got a call from Disneyland, and they said that they wanted to make that into a fine lithograph with the Disneyland Gallery imprint on it. We had that sold out within 4 weeks of that call, which means that Kathy and I are hopping. And suddenly that project, the different 20-odd projects we're working on, becomes on the front burner, and we're taking a trip to Los Angeles. We're looking at where Carl's going to sit. We're doing color checks. We're making sure that Scrooge's coat isn't purple, that matches the red of the watercolor. And we're organizing about 15 different people that are going to receive Carl down at the Disneyland Hotel in the garden room. And what an exciting event that was. Became a real Duck Club meeting. There was about 200 people there. The lithograph sold out 300 issues, and Carl signed them for the fans, and they come up, get Carl's signature. Uncle Scrooge McDuck was there, and we just go out and sit in those round tables, and it was a sumptuous feast, a beautiful dinner, and people talked ducks all afternoon. And we had famous celebrities there, and Malcolm Willits was there, and all the duck people on the West Coast seemed to congregate. Lots of fun. But getting back to the deadlines, everything seems to operate on that style. Even the Disneyana that's been running every 6 months now is a real deadline. It's tough to get a bronze out and a tile out within a 6 month period. For instance, on one tile, they just couldn't get the shade of blue correct, and that means a lot of fussing with a lot of blues to get the proper blue that's acceptable to us before we submit that sample to Disney, get the Disney okay, and then begin production. And then all the tiles can come out of a kiln broken, because to do a tile that's 20 inches by 20 inches is quite a feat. So that's a little bit of what we're doing at the studio. We're moving just as fast as we can, and we try to give, our whole goal is to give Carl all his freedom to just focus on his creativity, and that's fun for him, and we're having fun making money for him.
I think the most interesting project that we've had to work on would have to be the European tour. 7-week trip with a man that didn't even have a passport. And getting that passport, well, of course, he didn't have a birth certificate. But of course, when you're born in 1901 and you're born in the farm, you don't have birth certificates. It was a great time. A lot of hard work, a lot of 6- and 7-day weeks, but boy, going to Finland and Iceland and Carl at Paris Disneyland. He had so much fun. It was really a great time.
I remember at the Paris Disneyland, that's when Carl and I got that Jack Disney joke going.
Right.
Well, the joke was that Carl and I'd be walking along and always be in a group, and somebody would burst into the crowd and pull on my coattails and say, "Who is that? Is that Walt Disney?" And at first I was just kind of flat-footed because these people aren't wired into Disney. They're just happen to be at Disneyland Paris. And we came up with, no, that's not Walt Disney, that's Jack Disney. And he's been out of jail now and banned from the parks for about 20 years. Please don't tell anybody you saw him.
And of course, the French had a great sense of humor. They bought into it completely. Oh, okay.
They really did. And the other joke that we got going over there was at all those press conferences, and that left us flat-footed because we went to 11 countries and everyone had a press conference.
And there weren't supposed to be any, were there?
There weren't supposed to be any, and there'd be 125 people out there. For instance, in Germany and Italy, they had every TV station, every newspaper. There'd be 125 people, and this poor old Carl sitting up there. And
He did well.
they'd ask him all the time the same questions. Who's your favorite character? And Carl would say, depending on the project, sometimes it's Donald, sometimes it's Uncle Scrooge. But they asked him, this was very funny, who's your least favorite character? He'd say, love Louie, hate Dewey.
Oh, yes. And only the Donaldists wanted to know which one was Dewey.
But getting back to our job and our day-to-day routine, during that time period, and why we were working those 7-day weeks, is we had over 1,000 newspaper articles show up in Europe during that time period, and most of the major newspapers. And during the trip, we had another 1,000 articles show up on Carl. It was just a major event. People were so amazed that they'd ever see Carl. And one of the tough publicity things is from good friends, from everybody. We get these letters. The Carl Barks studio is killing Carl Barks, and he's going to die over there. And I'm 30 years old. I couldn't possibly make a trip like that. You're going to kill him. And we had an answer for that. And our answer was Carl Barks is healthier than most people in their 70s. And he chooses to go. He's our boss. He doesn't work for us. And he wants to go on that trip, and we totally support him. And should he happen to die on that trip, he'd prefer to have had that adventure than to just simply die in his bed.
Well, there's an awful lot of things coming up in the future. Some of them we can talk about and some of them we can't. But I think getting back on track with Disney Serigraphs is probably one of the shining stars in Carl's future. He started with the Disney Company back in the mid-30s, and I think he'd like to end his career with Disney as well.
Well, he's worked for Disney, the Walt Disney Company now for 60 years, and he just loves Disney. He's a real Disney fan, and he's doing so many things now. It's really fun. We have lithographs coming out in Germany. Sheriff of Bullet Valley is coming out, and a couple surprises. He's got lithographs coming out by the Walt Disney Company here, and now the new serigraph program with the silk screens, and we've got our bronze program for the figurines coming out.
Well, how about that video in Finland? That's going to be beautiful. I can't wait to see it.
I think that this is going to be the most exciting documentary because it's made by fans for fans, not for the television audience.
That's true. And Carl is comics. I think the heart and soul of Carl has been his comics and his comic books. Sure, he did some animation, and yes, he's done oil paintings and he loves them, but he is the consummate storyteller, and that's really what he loves, his comic books. And I think that this film, focusing so much on comics, is going to make it a fan favorite.
Yes.
So, it's good night from her.
Oh, that joke, I'll do that joke. It's good night from her.
And it's good night from him.
Good night.